today. So mainly I'm only occupying the stage just for a moment to thank Mark for yet again doing a wonderful thing in the gallery. And I remember that I know a little bit of the history of this one. I remember Felicity saying something about this amazing show, and I got to see the show myself when I was over there, and so I'm sort of super happy that it arrives here. And it remains, of course, a kind of key question, what it means, open form, and even if this is a contradiction in terms that was played with by Hansen starting more or less in the year I was born. So for some reason I think I have a kind of tragic relationship to this concept, but it's a concept that moves in such an interesting way from a heavy-duty architectural frame to what could be thought of as an art frame through a kind of experimental film practice. But all along the way, none of those contexts seem adequate to it. Like architecture doesn't seem to fully grasp the term, and maybe it was designed to resist architecture. So it was, of course, it would sort of, as it were, slip out of the grasp of the architects first. But I think it also almost equally quickly slides away from art and the teaching of art, and it did become very important in the teaching of art. And likewise with film. So it's a sort of an elusive concept that's a very, very seductive. So it gets picked up by people. And the people who pick it up are absolutely defined by the fact that they're not boring. So a series of extremely interesting people sort of fall in love with this concept, which ultimately escapes them. And so in a way, it pulls itself through from architecture, through art, through experimental film and beyond. And therefore exists as a kind of hypothesis about an alternative practice. So it's a sort of a concept that's more interesting than anyone who's ever picked it up, and may have been, in a certain sense, more interesting than Hansen himself. And I think that no matter how brilliant Hansen was, I think what's truly brilliant is always to come up with something that's more interesting than you are. And it happens all the time. Like if you're obsessed with things like I am, like making the perfect coffee, there is a moment in which it happens, you make it. But it's better than you because you can never repeat it. And so I think concepts that are better than people become better than departments and better than fields, and then really become pedagogical instruments. And surely open form is exactly of that order. So I think it's potentially extraordinarily healthy for the school to, as it were, bring it back through the loop and stage again the question open form back in an architectural concept. Of course, we may not learn the lesson as well as we should because we are so fatally attracted to and addicted to art, and in particular experiments between architecture and art. So I think that this exhibition is also very interesting in the ways in which it continues our exploration of the all too solid line between architecture and art. So I think it's just yet another kind of healthy meal that Mark and his friends are providing. But anyway, hand you over to Mark. But also just to say to those of you who have come with Mark to do this, we super welcome the collaboration and also the kinds of questions that are going to come out of this. And if this exhibition is a success, as I know it will be, we will not be able to exhibit the same way in that space again. And so I think it's potentially, even without knowing it, going to kind of alert us to things that go on in the Arthuros Gallery. And as you know, the Arthuros Gallery has been one of the very, very central sites for the school to reflect upon itself and its limits and so on. So in that kind of classic way, it is an extremely closed form. The Ross Gallery could not be more closed. The windows are shut off. The building did move, by the way. Just as a piece of small history, the Buell building is the oldest building in Columbia, and it was not there. It was down at what would be now more or less the bottom of the steps of Low Library. So actually the building itself moves. So watch out, even if the Arthuros Gallery is a very precisely defined space, and therefore it's a good space for thinking about the way open form subverts closed spaces. Weirdly enough, that building, once an insane asylum, And once again tonight, another insane asylum is on the move, is potentially on the move. Anyway, just to say it's a good thing that's happening, and thank you to Mo.
Thank you, Dean Wigley. Just one small correction. There's something in the nature of the open forum project for Hansen and among his followers that is invested in ideas of seriality and process and repetition. So it's not surprising that, Mark, you might think that this is the same exhibition that appeared in Europe, but in fact it's the result of intensely new archival research on behalf of some of us, and especially Łukasz and Natalia in Poland and me long distance. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, because there's something about the nature of open forum that leads to these ideas. But I think it's just important to point out that because these exhibitions are, incredibly exciting but laborious and painful processes, the archive as ever resists, our incursions. But this is just to say that there are all kinds of thanks and acknowledgements due, and because although Mark said he was not going to offer much on open forum, he's already said everything I have to say, so I will move on to acknowledgements now. But it's important to note that the exhibitions that we do in the gallery are produced under the constraints that one normally associates with a university gallery. And as a result, the exhibition was only possible with the absurd devotion of many people that I would like to acknowledge here. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Trust for Mutual Understanding and Carrie Thompson for the support for producing the exhibition. We'd like to thank Yola Gola at the Museum of the Academy of Fine Arts, Warsaw, for the loan of documents and her archival assistance. The artist Zofia Kulik has been an incredibly enthusiastic and generous contributor to the exhibition. And as ever, the exhibition was produced only because of the extraordinary determination and commitment of the exhibition's crew and this year's exhibition's assistants, Annie Coombs and Luca Ferranelli. Adam Bandler, the CCCP exhibition assistant, has been heroic, working with me and the other curators, organizing, designing, and producing the exhibition. And Natalia Sielewicz, who is assistant curator of the exhibition, worked closely and untiringly with me and Łukasz, researching and preparing the exhibition. And as Mark suggested, I'd like to, something in this narrative belongs to Felicity. She first introduced me to Łukasz somewhere in the East Village, and so in a sense, she is the instigator of this project. And finally, of course, to Łukasz Ronduda, my collaborator on this exhibition. And as Mark also suggested, the exhibition falls under at least two GSAP categories. The first is the Living Archive, which is a series of exhibitions we have developed at the school focusing on important and under-examined architectural archives. And it also falls under a newer category that we're calling the Global Experiments in Art and Architecture Initiative. And so aptly, as is obvious from the title, the exhibition hinges around the interaction between art and architecture, specifically around the work of the architect Oscar Hansen and his theory of open form, and how this is translated, interpreted, and appropriated by his students at the Warsaw Academy of Fine Arts. And before we talk about that in slightly more detail, I want to return to my collaborator, Łukasz Ronduda, because as much as a brief introduction to the exhibition would have to not only mention something of open form, it would have to mention something of Łukasz's continued provocation to those of us who did not know the work of Polish artists in the 60s and 70s. And this provocation comes in two parts. In the first part, similarities to work that we might know here in the so-called West is offered, and then just as this similarity appears obvious, indeed inescapable, a reverse procedure occurs. And in this, despite such obvious similarities, the political and social context of Poland in the post-war is articulated, which means that these similarities, which we thought we had discovered, deserve to be scrutinized and doubted. And so this operation is much more than a simple comparison, more than a contrasting analysis. It is something much more hallucinatory, uncanny, a kind of simultaneous familiarization and defamiliarization of the work. And something of this process is at work also in the appearance of open form in the exhibition. And as Dean Wigley has also suggested, open form appears first in the work of Oscar Hansen. Oscar Hansen, architect of well-known projects, student of Pierre Jeanneret, Fernand Léger, participant at Team 10 meetings in Otterloo 1959 and Bagnols-sur-Cèze 1960, where he delivers open form as something which is not so unrecognizable as a critique, which is to say not so unrecognizable and familiar to us as a critique of modernist dogma. Then at some point, through his teaching at the Fine Arts Academy and through the work of his students and his own later work, open form emerges as something, if not stranger and not more interesting, then at least as something much more exploratory and something that opens a series of new directions for Hansen and for the artists that follow. And so in a sense, this is the trajectory that the exhibition is also going to follow. And so when we talk about this transition, just a few images to illustrate. This is Oscar Hansen describing the relationship between the small number and the large number, but also the relationship between open and closed form. This is a series of images of didactic exercises or apparatuses that Oscar Hansen had his students develop their approach to open form through at the Academy of Fine Arts. This is an installation of an exhibition called the Redoubt Room in 1957, one of the early instances of Hansen's use of open form. And this is a slightly later version of it, and I'll talk about these images in a second. This is an image that belongs to the Linear Continuous System project. Sorry. And then this is how open form begins to appear in the work of his followers. This is a still from the film Game on an Actress's Face, 1971. This is from Mercury by Kulik, 1975. This is a still of Oscar Hansen in action, participating in a collective event that was filmed for the documentary Feeling or Groping One's Way, as it's been more provocatively translated. And this is from the collective project Game on Morell's Hill. And this from Studio A, another film in the open form genre. So the open form and closed form are just the beginning of a large lexicon that one would need in order to start to understand these projects. But just a little bit more about open form. Open form for Hansen emerged in reaction to the pathological and limiting condition he described as closed form. For Hansen, the latter category characterized both a modernist doctrine of standardization and typification that he argued delivered hermetic monuments unable to react to creative input from inhabitants and users, as well as many aspects of the post-war architectural social milieu in Poland. Hansen postulated that open form would deliver a flexible architecture as well as a mode of communicative interaction and participation sensitive to the role of individuals and to individual idiosyncrasies within the composition of a collective. And it's important to hear this idea of the individual participating in a collective, especially in looking at the work of his students and followers that come after. Responsive to local, urban, or natural conditions, open form would be capable of transformation, growth, and evolution. And appropriately, Hansen's own conception and application of open form was self-transforming with various manifestations and strategies at a range of scales. And you see this in the work from the small gallery installations to the very large linear continuous system. Indeed, scalability was one of its central tenets. While the first open form experiments were a series of small-scale installations, the largest reach occurred through plans for the LCS. And the LCS was developed as a series of proposals that was intended to reorganize patterns of transportation and inhabitation along linear trajectories following an evolutionary growth process that would help overcome boundaries, forms of control, and eventually systems of land ownership. So the linear continuous system as the largest instance of open form would elicit collective participation and as well complete displacement of geopolitical control systems. So you see something about the ambitions attached to open form. I believe Łukasz is going to say much more on this lexicon that I hinted at, but just to deliver a few of the terms that would be necessary to make sense of the open form adventure: working with a camera, camera provocation, interrupted projection, revealing the complex form, etc., etc. You know, there's a kind of veritable scientific handbook of terminology that is helpful in really understanding the precision of the experiments that the artists were working through. So with that, I'm going to move on to an introduction to tonight's speakers. We're going to have 4 brief presentations, a small conversation, some questions, and then we will go over to see the show. Felicity Scott is going to speak first. Felicity, you all know, faculty member, author, and widely published, and director of the CCCP program, Critical, Conceptual, and Curatorial Practices here at GSAP. Łukasz, my collaborator on the exhibition, will follow. Łukasz is a scholar, curator, author, widely published, but most recently his new book has just come out, Polish Art of the 1970s. Chrissie Iles will follow. Chrissie is the curator of film and video at the Whitney Museum. Again, numerous publications, catalog, and exhibitions, including most recently, I believe, co-curator of the retrospective of Dan Graham's work, Beyond. And we're going to finish with Anton, Vidokle, artist, widely exhibited, Venice Biennale, Tate Modern, etc. And he is also the founder of the famous eFlux. Thank you.
Okay, you can have the first image, please. Thank you. Thanks, Mark and Łukasz, for a fantastic exhibition. I haven't seen the very final form, but it was certainly looking spectacular earlier in the day. So I've been asked to focus on Oscar Hansen, and just want to offer some brief remarks, certainly on the concept of open form, but also why it might have translated so effectively from the experimental architectural context into that of these artistic games or visual games and for-camera activities, which I'm sure Łukasz will talk to in more detail, that characterize the work of the students at the Warsaw Fine Arts Academy. And I just wanted to say that in some regards, these archival films and slide works not only speak to the remarkable history of Polish film at this moment, but also really offer one of the most provocative examples of the legacy of Hansen's thinking. So Hansen, as Mark mentioned, first presented the open form thesis. It's actually called The Open Form in Architecture, the Art of the Greater Number, at the 1959 CIAM conference in Oslo, an event, of course, that marked the demise of this modernist institution and the emergence of Team 10. And many members of Team 10 would quickly pick up on Hansen's concept, even if not always giving him credit for it. And what I want to do is just to set out 2 sort of interrelated aspects of his thesis that I think informed the artistic games that are captured in these films. First, and less frequently acknowledged, is his concern with transforming extant relations between the individual and the collective that Wasiuta mentioned, an old theme we might note, but one that would take on a particular valence in Hansen's work. And so with respect to developing housing typologies for the so-called greater number, or the multitude, he stressed the importance of addressing concrete people, not the so-called abstract average. And so Hansen proposed then that individuality had become what he called lost in the collective, and that the individual stands apart from the action. And what he meant by this, and what his response was to this, was in the first instance to make those individuals sort of legible or visible as differentiated elements of the collective. Open form, then, as he argued, would be manifest by the discernibleness, and this is his term, at least in translation, the discernibleness of the individual in the multiple, and the discernibleness, in turn, of the number, of the multitude. So such discernibleness, then, we could say, would be at once a visual or a formal phenomena, the sort of visual registration of difference within a larger field, as well as the result of a type of memory produced through bodily participation within a process that would, as Hansen would later stress, be produced through a type of bodily participation within a process that would be part of a type of psychological aspect of his ambition. So he talked about helping us define ourselves and find our place in the space and time we live in. And in the second instance, his aim was to make that individual, of course, an operative player in this action, when he said that the individual had been divorced from the action, or, in Hansen's words, to make him indispensable in the creation of his own surroundings. And so central then to what Hansen would call a completely new architectural task was the communication of a radical heterogeneity that the subject would both produce visually and spatially through their actions and interactions, and also sort of incorporate psychologically as a form of defense against the totalizing forces of that greater number. And such differentiation would lead, or would not lead, not lead to the isolation of individuals in space, but would give rise to what he referred to as a type of continuous space or group form that would be comprised of individualities, but would not eliminate conflicts, or in his words, polemics, but rather see these conflicts as part of the engine of transformation. And so Hansen recognized then that establishing this type of participatory role in the creation of one's surroundings was not at all a simple task, that it would be subject, of course, to ongoing processes of negotiation, and as such, that it would involve people within a political process. Second, and closely related, open form entailed not only a move away from the design, actually I think I skipped an image here, we'll come back to this, of a fixed or finite object, ceding aspects of this to the user, but also a register and shift to the question of the interrelation between elements and even disciplines, and hence to the notion of environment. And in a recent interview, Hansen recounted that in Oterloo, he said, "I didn't really understand the significance of what I was doing. I was doing something, and suddenly it turns out that it's called environment." In 1971 then, just a couple of years after, he'd begun to take his students out of the Visual Structures Studio for the open-air seminars. He announced somewhat unexpectedly that, and I quote, "The idea of architecture and plastic art based on the open design stems from the principles of the situationist movement, also calling for the active collaboration of the user in order to capture what he called the unfolding process of life itself." And so it's taken open form, as in many other process-oriented and event-based practices of the 60s and 70s, was the question of how to produce a work without, of course, predetermining its final form, how to set out something like a minimal structuring system, such as a script or a set of constraints, that would facilitate interactions, in this sense, forms of participation, without determining their nature, and which would allow for this sense of openness or transformation, and even, I wanted to stress, something like feedback. So indeed, these strategies then, with their ideals of fostering new paradigms of communication and social exchange, were very much indebted to an encounter with cybernetic and information technologies, the games at times almost mimicking the at once recursive and largely indeterminate structures of post-industrial technologies. And so you'll hear, as these images suggest, the language of communication theory at work, when the artists reflect on the modes of interaction taking place between them. And so here we find one of the artists saying to the other, "I am transmitting, you are receiving." And they note that a condition of their participation then is that they will abandon their obtrusive I or ego, elsewhere I think translated as intrusive. So that means that they or their actions in some sense have become relay points within a type of communication network. Their messages cast, of course, as sort of packets of information circulating within these systems. And we also find in Feeling One's Way, which Marx showed an image of, we find Hansen himself invoking the rhetoric of communication theory and making distinctions between a sort of unidirectional communication of traditional messages. And in his words, and I quote, "Communication is a form of exchange between two or more people where, because of their multi-directionality, the message is enriched significantly, broadening the sphere of communication." Again, the sort of indeterminacy being the product of a type of encounter. And so then this experience of a rapidly transforming technological milieu led to a sense then of the exacerbated rate of obsolescence, not only in the technological domain, but also, and crucial to Hansen's work as an architect, in its social correlate. So what Hansen refers to as closed form had in this sense come to seem anachronistic, since, in his words, it had not accepted the changes in the modes of life and had become obsolete before it was even realized. So that is, it couldn't sponsor new social relations. So I just want to quickly go through a couple of the projects. I'm not going to speak to this one, but just to begin by saying that although Hansen would continue to privilege these large-scale planning projects, such as the linear continuous systems, when he talked about the objectives of open form, especially later on, that the concept was tested out most effectively at the scale of interventions and interactions with artistic environments, with gallery spaces and the like. And in a recent interview, he recalled that everything started with the exhibition pavilions. It's the micro scale, but they were very important. He's saying that the micro scale, they were very important as a moment in the history of open forms. Yes, he continued, exhibitions with the laboratory of open form. And so for the Polish pavilion that you see here at the Izmir International Festival of '55, Hansen and his collaborator Tomaszewski devised this modular system of 8 by 8 meter hyperbolic paraboloid tensile structures that they called the HT system after their names, which produced this type of dense visual space. And Hansen referred to this as almost like a type of op-art surface with machines and people being displayed and sort of walking amongst them. He said, "This is what I call the experience of the background." His pavilion a few years later in Sao Paulo, if in some senses sort of formally reminiscent of the predecessor at Izmir, had undergone a very important change. So unlike the sort of fixed module of the Ibiza pavilion, what he called this biotechnical structure was transformable and non-modular in its geometry, its form shifting gently with the wind and other forms of participation. So in other words, it was conceived of as more responsive to its environment. And as Hansen's remarkable diagram on the lower right suggests, the point here is the production of a type of heterogeneity, the logic at work being that of facilitating this form of differentiation. And this adaptability was perhaps even more literally cast into gallery projects. First, the 1958 Zakręta, I can't pronounce it, Zakręta, gallery, in which, through providing movable walls and floor levels within a steel frame cube, the designers sought to offer the curators and artists what they call total freedom for the design of the enclosed space. And so we find that with the institutional space of the museum no longer a constraint on the form or scale of artistic production, that the building might, in Hansen's words, assist the birth of the art of the future. This is its more utopian dimension. And Hansen's competition entry, in turn, for the Museum of Modern Art in Skopje of '66 forms a related experiment. Surely we might say one of the strangest ideas for a museum. The hydraulically powered hexagonal modules of this transformable environment could be multiply deployed and redeployed as gallery spaces, then withdraw or retract completely underground. And this design thought to produce a type of animated buildings. In Hansen's words, it would be like space growing out of the ground like a tree. And so I wanted to just stress then that at the heart of these two gallery projects was a new type, or sort of new register of functionalist thinking, one no longer premised on an optimized relation between form and function, or between space and program, as had been sort of idealized in aspects of modernism, but one that would be updatable, transformable. And here we find ourselves then at the very crux of a modernist architectural problematic. This sort of fantasy of short-circuiting the threat posed to the discipline's role in giving material and aesthetic form to social needs, the threat that was inherent to this sort of exacerbated rate of obsolescence and seemingly solved through the capacity of a perpetual transformation, evinced a type of mourning for the integrity of those relations. Moreover, if Hansen's architecture had, up until Skopje, been conceptually striving towards the indeterminate and flexible logics of electronics and cybernetic control mechanism, here that relation would take on a new dimension. So the museum's modules were literally to be electronically controlled by the artist. He said this electronically controlled gallery instrument goes beyond the rich potential for exposition in itself by, again, provoking a new art, sculpting an architectural space live before the eyes of a public to create visual performances. Again, this sort of utopian dimension to the work. And so within the context of architecture, more generally, we might say that such an appeal to open-endedness and indeterminacy can be read as an attempt to constitute a refusal of architecture's capacity to program or sort of to invest a space or environment with a normative logic, and with that a certain disciplinary and ideological function with respect to dominant techniques of power. And in turn, to uncouple or break open this relation, certainly in attempting to cede the authority of the architect to the user by making them a participant in the construction of their environment, was in principle understood as a means to overcome this determinate and functional logic and open prospects for a different type of environment, but also, and crucial to Hansen, for new forms of subjectivity and political agency within it. But I wanted to suggest that if Hansen might have been correct, that architecture could in principle serve as a site or as a type of prosthetic for micro-political forms of engagement in a larger environment, if he was right in believing that the subject gained a level of agency and self-reflection through interaction with or the sort of completion of a transformable object, that this promise, and certainly insofar as it translated into large buildings, was in the first instance largely foreclosed by architecture's very materiality and the economic scale of such transformation. And this would, of course, be the case not only in Poland, but within most megastructural projects, such as the Pompidou in Paris. But in addition, with these galleries, I wanted to suggest that the artist or curator had in turn been sort of recast as something like a programmer, controlling the form of an environment that no longer took a particular organization without their participation, and as such that it was an environment that potentially facilitated an ever more sort of exacting or precise management of those relations between the subject and space, i.e. that it was not simply an open space, but a space now managed digitally and as such potentially even further closed. So we might speculate then that the translation, we might speculate that the translation of open form from architectural and exhibition projects to one based in games or performance works and their filmic documentation meant that open form had found a more appropriate site or medium in which to be actualized. These games served, of course, to sponsor new articulations of collective social activity in which art was staged as an environmental practice and in which the environment was understood as a type of field of communication. So again, unlike these projects requiring massive state sponsorship, such as the housing estates, which could quickly close down, these practices could occupy the interstices of an often technocratic and at times repressive political milieu, while producing a certain spacing or opening within them, perhaps even new modes of political engagement. But I also want to say that to simply attribute this to these other media is to perhaps to quickly overlook the degree to which open form was equally invested in fostering experimentation in modes of expression that might model these new forms of collective social relations or modes of interaction. And so to this end, we might recall that Hansen's thesis operated simultaneously at many levels. Yes, openness appeared not only in the realm of flexibility and formal composition that achieved to these transformable components within a system, but also visually registering relations between the individual and the collective, as well as within the modes of social interaction between subjects and their environment. So if typically conceived then within architecture as derived from formal flexibility, wanted to suggest that open form can also operate quite independently of any type of transformable infrastructure, even at a conceptual level, and that other modes of interaction remained, yes, that we can think then of openness certainly as a type of indeterminacy, not simply of form, but also in this register of social relations as Hansen proposed. Thank you.
Good evening. I will speak about political context of the works we are showing at our exhibition. And especially I will talk about Oskar Hansen students, Zofia Kulik and Przemysław Kwiek, who formed this artistic duo called Kwiekulik. So I will use frequently this name, Kwiekulik, so to describe this couple, Przemysław Kwiek and Zofia Kulik. And this is one of the slide projections we are showing at our exhibition. It is called Variations of Red and the Way of Edward Gierek. Can we play it? Because it is like still. No. But so this is another reason to visit gallery after my speech. Okay. So Kwiekulik, the talented students of Oskar Hansen at the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw, were the first artists to conceive a radical political turn to Hansen's theory of the open form. Since the beginning of the 70s, Kwiekulik pioneered the transformation of artistic practice into one of social experimentation, more laboratory than studio, creating artistic groups that promoted values and models of non-authoritarian social system. Kwiekulik, as candidates to Communist Party at the beginning of the 70s, postulated connecting politics and art. They wanted politicians to be as creative as artists, and artists to be as committed to transforming reality as politicians. And this slideshow was meant to stress that, this common goals. Kwiekulik they tried to use their kind of subversive revisionist position within the system to severely criticize Polish Communist Party. The party, which had swept internationalism for nationalism in the 60s and tried to combine socialism with consumerism and elements of capitalism in the early 70s. Both communist administrations, Gomułka's in the 60s and Gierek in the 70s, tried in this hybrid manner to legitimize the authoritarian system in Poland. According to Kwiekulik, who wanted to be faithful to the true of socialist revolutionary idea, such cynical attempts killed the emancipatory universalistic potential of socialism, diluted now by nationalism and consumerism. Kwiekulik's reformist practices were centered around attempts to introduce new, more flexible and interdisciplinary mechanisms to the socialist state's existing procedures, whether in politics or in the field of cultural policy. Let us add that those attempts were based on conclusions drawn not only from revolutionary artistic ideas, Hansen's open form in particular, but also from the progress being made in science. Especially they were kind of observing the developments of cybernetics. They also established the cybernetics like artistic associations, artistic division at the Polish Cybernetic Association. And the regime, however, rejected the offer, preferring to exploit those innovations and discoveries for the purpose of strengthening its own apparatus of bureaucratic control, while creating an appearance of liberalization and a greater openness towards the rest of the world. Preferred to use them to modernize the constantly growing centralized state administration that tried to control almost every aspect of citizens' lives. Kwiekulik and other revisionists, with their proposal of modern scientific self-organizing open systems of communication, knowledge production or management, were rejected. Their idea that new discoveries of science and art should be put to work towards the goal of non-authoritarian and truly democratic socialist state in which individual and collective emancipation is possible was destroyed. Trying to intensify the revolutionary process, they were defeated by a process that Antonio Negri described as a consolidation of socialism, very characteristic for the Soviet bloc states at the turn of the 60s and 70s. Negri wrote, "The problem is that at certain point the consolidation of socialism defeated the revolutionary process, holding back, blocking that threshold of social and political movement that was born from the struggle against power, against exploitation. Consolidating itself, socialism achieved enormous results. In the first place, it demonstrated that it was possible. In the second place, it imposed on the bourgeois economy a radical modification. But in its consolidation was also betrayal, corruption in the place of generation, bureaucratization of power instead of its liberation." Negri argues that as a result of its consolidation and bureaucratization, socialism killed itself, committed suicide. But Kwiekulik, working in such conditions described by Negri, in a utopian manner tried to speed up a revolutionary process. They permanently problematized the distinction imposed and strictly observed by the regime between the public and the private, trying to redefine the relations between these two spheres, considering them in terms of interpenetration, their being common, rather than in terms of binary opposites. They did so in the artistic collectives they formed, and in the integrative games and interactions that were based on initiating open-ended and spontaneous processes of communication. Describing that period, Kwiekulik wrote, "We believed in the possibility of smooth collaboration with other artists, in the possibility of collective work, free from the problem of authorship, from worries over what is whose and who did what. An artist should be free and unselfish, and the new should be generated at the meeting point of me and the others in interaction." Kwiekulik believed they acted politically by creating areas that blurred the borders between individual and between individual creative gestures and their sum, forming an emergent collective work. In this, they seemed to be creating something in the vein of the common capacity to produce and reproduce the social in freedom. According to Negri, when you speak of common, you don't think of the public, but of something that isn't either private or public. The real socialism, which Kwiekulik opposed in the 70s Poland, confused the common with the public. That is, reduced it to the property of the state. The project of Kwiekulik, of the common, consisted instead in overcoming both the concept of the private and that of the public, in going beyond those two categories to arrive at communal management. And quoting Negri, "It is everyone together, and this is not a utopia." Following the rejection by the regime of Kwiekulik's offer, the artists continued their efforts to undermine the state-imposed distinction between the public and the private. They tried to overcome the state's and the party's monopoly for managing the common good, or rather for defining common values as something completely separate from private life, because communist regime never imagined the common, if not just like the capitalists, as something that is appropriated. And to conclusion, the Polish Communist Party rejection of Kwiekulik's reform proposals and the subsequent launch of a secret police inquiry into their activities reveals one more aspect of the conflict between the duo artistic political investigations and the party. The Prague Spring of 1968 demonstrated that a revolution carried out by revisionists, that is, from within the communist system, could be far more dangerous than any ideological aggression from outside. In 1970s capitalist Poland, Kwiekulik were a classic example of Zizkan subversion through identification, proving that the dominant ideology could be undermined by a too literal identification with it, because its successful functioning requires a minimal distance from its explicit rules. That is why the reformist Kwiekulik, trying to realize socialist ideas in too literal fashion, were treated particularly harshly by the regime, which did not identify with those ideas at all. Their fight for the truth of a socialist idea in a socialist country where no one believed in it except them ended in almost complete isolation, in exclusion from both politics dominated by cynicism and from contemporary art dominated by pragmatic escapism. So thank you.
I'm going to talk about the American and European context for what's being discussed so far. Excuse me, if I could have the first slide. Do I do that or do you do that? Thank you. This is Jonas Mikas, of course. And I want to just throw out a few ideas for discussion later, so this is not in any way any kind of academically formed thesis or anything like that, but it just struck me as very interesting that at the same time as these open form experiments were taking place in Warsaw, that there was a lot of collectivity going on throughout the USA and also in Europe, especially in England, in fact, and how differently it plays out in a communist country like Poland, and then here in the USA with whether it's collective activity like Woman House in LA, the Conceptual Art Museum, the Factory, Anthology Film Archives, or in England the Arts Lab in London, the Filmmakers Co-ops in New York and London, the Exploding Galaxy in London with David Madala, the Artist Placement Group with John Latham, Stuart Brisley and all those artists, within a very sort of capitalist environment in that case, but in an environment which was undergoing great sort of economic depression at the time. So I begin with this image of Jonas Mikas, because Jonas, who's of course from Lithuania, and so we have probably the most influential figure in cinema, experimental cinema in New York, coming from not so far from Poland. Which I think is an interesting thing to note. And the Jonas and the Anthology Film Archives space that he established at 80 Worcester Street in Soho, where so many artists lived at the time, really created this very sort of collective space, which had a big impact on artists, everybody you could think of who was living there, who came and saw films there, but not only films, also performances, expanded cinema pieces, video, works, etc. And of course, Jonas was very close to George Maciunas, a fellow Lithuanian, and his collectivity, which was inspired by Russian revolutionary ideas, was very radical. It not only did it form all the flux houses in Soho, George Maciunas probably gave his life for that in the end. He got beaten up so many times by the mob when he was establishing those flux houses for the artists to live in. I think there were, how many were there? 18 in the end, buildings. Many artists still live in them today from that period. But also the sense of collectivity that was at the basis of Fluxus. I feel that Jonas's presence is very important in relation to this American context. Now, of course, Warhol's factory, which I'm not going to really discuss, but just mention as another form of collectivity. Of course, it revolved around the persona of Warhol himself, but most collectives ultimately, in my opinion, do, and they're usually men. And the backdrop in America, of course, was Vietnam, and I cannot emphasize enough, in my opinion, how important Vietnam was to the American situation here and the way in which artists were thinking at the time. Here's an illustration of that moment with Howard Lester's film 1 Week in Vietnam, made in 1970, which is color photographs of from Life magazine of all the American soldiers killed in Vietnam in 1 week, with their numbers flicking by as the photos flick by on the left to the soundtrack of the Everly Brothers' Bye Bye Love. But perhaps one of the most obvious comparisons that could be made is in television, because of course nowhere but in the States have we seen American, and we still see it, and television playing such a major role in politics and influencing people to such an extreme degree. And this image on the screen is of an issue of Radical Software, Volume 2, number 2. And Radical Software was started by Beryl Corot, Phyllis Gershony, and Iris Schneider, and it first appeared in the spring of 1970, just not so long after low-cost portable video equipment became available to artists. And in the first issue it stated, "Power is no longer measured in land, labor, or capital, but by access to information and the means to disseminate it." That was in issue number 1. And David Ross, there's a wonderful website with Radical Software, and every single issue is online. You can read it. And David Ross's introduction is well worth reading. And he talks about the genesis of Radical Software in a way that I think really has a very interesting relationship to this open form principle. The idea for the journal came about in the fall, and I'm quoting David, of 1969, right after the Woodstock Festival. The Vietnam War was raging. A previously powerless and voiceless generation in the US and abroad found that they could no longer trust their governments or the newspapers and television networks to communicate any truth except those in the service of the prevailing order. And so the urge to create new cultural structures was a genuine attempt to help lead a generation out of the wasteland in which many felt entrapped. This assortment of artists, writers, musicians, and filmmakers shared a vision. They imagined a social order in which new forms of community might be formed and maintained by the development of an interlocking network of shared intelligence, or what Jean Youngblood called a videosphere. And I think Jean Youngblood's idea of this videosphere is very interesting. They imagined a world in which the contest of ideas and values could take place freely and openly, outside of the existing institutional framework, and in active opposition to the worldview constructed and maintained by broadcast commercial TV. They proposed not only a reordered power structure, but also a new information order in which the very idea of hierarchical power structure might be transformed or even eliminated. For them, Radical Software would provide a platform for the exploration of alternatives to the dominant mass media structure, and would do so in a manner that mixed the subjective style of the new journalism with a non-precious, self-published format of the Whole Earth Catalogue. So, Radical Software as a journal really, I think, epitomized a mood that was prevailing in America at the beginning of the 70s, at the same time that these experiments were taking place in Warsaw. And what's on the screen now is Ant Farm's media burn from 1975, an action by a collective in San Francisco called Ant Farm, who, dressed as astronauts, drove this reconstructed Eldorado 1959 Cadillac convertible through a flaming wall of flaming TV sets. And you can see how sort of dramatic it looks. And they used obviously these very obvious two cultural icons of America, the car, the television set, to really question the whole sort of American heroic ideal of a sort of technological superiority, if you like. And they also styled the action after the news coverage of a space launch. So they included very sort of melodramatic interviews with journalists who had gathered there. Doug Hall played John F. Kennedy, who was giving a speech to journalists about the problem of mass media monopolies impact on American life. So you can see that television was very much at the center of what many American artists were thinking. And likewise, WGBH commissioned artists. And so there was a very odd situation where artists were railing against television, and television itself was momentarily opening up. And so WGBH was commissioning artists like Namjoon Paik, you can see his Global Groove, his image from Global Groove up here, to make works for television. This was also the case with the Dilexi Foundation and KQED TV over in San Francisco, and the Dilexi Foundation brought together a group of artists, including Walter de Maria, to make a series of pieces for television. This is still from Walter de Maria's Hardcore from 1969, the film that he made for television. And the idea was that it would be broadcast on television, which it was. So there was this very interesting moment, which was also occurring in England. And this is David Hall, a very, very important British video artist. It's astonishing no one in America or New York's shown him yet, but I hope they will. Who made a piece called Television Interruptions in 1973, commissioned by Scottish Television, who in another unprecedentedly open moment in British television commissioned a group of artists, including David, to make these inserts into television programs during the evening. So there was nothing to say they were going to appear. And as David said, these transmissions were a surprise, a mystery, no explanations, reactions were various. I viewed one piece in an old gents' club in Edinburgh. The TV was permanently on, but the occupants were oblivious to it, reading newspapers or dozing. When the TV began to fill with water, newspapers dropped, the dozing stopped. When the piece finished, normal activity was resumed. And as you can see in this still, as you can imagine, what happened was suddenly EastEnders, or whatever was on at the time, Crossroads, Z-Cars, was interrupted by the television screens suddenly appearing as though a tank, and a tap turned on water, and then suddenly the screen filled up as though it was a tank filling with water. So you can see just both that this was going on, this questioning around television as a very sort of dominant form of control. This was being questioned by artists on both sides of the Atlantic, in England and in the States. Now, in relation to architecture, to bring it back to architecture for a moment, we also have the studio asserting itself in the work of artists. So in terms of physical space, one could say that the white cube of the gallery or the studio, although the studio never tends to be quite as white and pristine as the gallery, but the white cube in the most general sense was, if you like, almost a kind of Oedipal parent against which artists were flinging themselves. And this piece, very well known, of course, to us all by Bruce Nauman, walking in an exaggerated manner around the perimeter of a square, shows Nauman walking around the studio. He's got masking tape masking off the floor, and he shifts his hips very exaggeratedly at every step in this very sort of game-like movements that are very monotonous, and he just gets round and round and round, clearly influenced both by Samuel Beckett and also by the dancer Anna Halprin, who herself was making a very sort of open systems kind of radical dance using the local community as well as dancers. And this questioning of the artwork as an object by creating something that was an action in the studio that nobody could see but then was captured on videotape is part of a sort of decentering, a sort of pulling apart of the both physical space of the gallery and the physical presence of the object. Richard Serra was also doing the same thing. In this film, Hand Scraping, you can see him with Phil Glass, his very sculptor-like forearms on the left, Phil Glass's forearms on the right, and they scrape very carefully a number of steel shavings off the floor of the studio in this very task-based performative action that became very sort of typical of this sort of post-minimalist activity, the sort of deconstruction of the object. They very carefully pick up the very last iron filing, or steel shaving, I should say, in what would normally be seen as a very unimportant action, could be much more efficiently achieved by the brisk sweep of a broom. And so the positioning of this metal debris of an unseen, supposedly sculptural object somewhere, the artist's hand and body, the studio floor, and the detritus become the central subject of the film. So this turning away of the object and replacing it by an action. And then, of course, we have another, a sort of architectural, not in the studio in this case, but architectural questioning of the object through, in this case, slides in Dan Graham's project for Slide Projector. And Dan said, and I quote, "The Carousel slide projector becomes an object, the message to be the mechanism of the medium in itself as an object." And basically what Dan did was he took 4 small panes of glass, and he made a box with a mirror in the bottom, and he photographed all 4 sides, and then photographed them again, getting closer and closer to the middle point, and then put another box inside and photographed that, and then another, until you have the box and the other box and the other box, all photographed 20 times. He then flipped the slides backwards, so that you get basically 2 lots of 40 slides. So he builds and unbuilds this object. And so during the projection of all the 80 images, the spatial ambiguity of the mirror space moves cyclically, and it sort of inverts itself. So it builds and unbuilds. So we're seeing a piece that's located somewhere between the materials and experiences of sculpture and photography, but it's not essential to either. So it captures the experience almost of walking around a sculpture, and the spectator's perception becomes the key to the piece. So it's also an image of the experience of looking at sculpture. So here we have this sort of decentering of the object, this collapsing of the central authority of the object, which Bob Morris in a piece like Neoclassic in 1971 does too. Bob Morris made a very important show at the Tate in London in 1971, in which he built a series of objects, which I think is very interesting in relation to the open form experiments. And in these objects, which were made of wood, the visitors to the exhibition had to engage with the objects. They could roll around on them, move around on top of them, put them on top of themselves, do whatever they wanted to them. The objects became objects with which the audience could play. Eventually, the Tate was so disturbed by the fact that people were getting injured by their enthusiastic engagement with the objects that they took the objects away, closed down the show, and insisted that Bob Morris replace these objects with some more conventional sculptures. So what Morris did was he made a film called Neoclassic, in which a figure engages with these objects, so that the record of it was there in perpetuity, but the film also became another artwork in itself. So again, you see this sort of decentering, and the way in which also someone like Dennis Oppenheim with this 4-screen film installation Echo from 1973 takes the artist's hand and takes the paintbrush away, takes the canvas, takes anything but the hand and the wall, and slaps the hand against the wall. In 4 projections, this has a kind of contrapuntal oral composition, which seems to be has a feeling of breaking down the architectural space. So you have almost a literal sense of this, the artist trying to kind of destroy the architectural space boundaring him. And again, Dennis Oppenheim, 2-stage transfer drawing, retreating to a past state. And in this piece, again, very interesting in relation to the idea of both play and the game, and also the role of video and the body as material, and the wall as sight. And in this piece, Dennis Oppenheim's son draws a pattern on Dennis Oppenheim's back, and Dennis Oppenheim tries to draw the same pattern on the wall, what he imagines his son is drawing. There's a very interesting relationship to those sort of closed circuit systems of video there, but also, again, the perception of the decontextualizing of the idea of the wall as the space for painting and, by implication, drawing. We also have architectural space and painting being questioned in the work of Paul Mccarthy in his performative videotapes of the early 70s. In this one, he's drawing a lion on the floor with paint. We have Naumann applying makeup to himself in art makeup. There's this sense of the mask, the importance of the mask, and in fact, this piece relates to his word piece, The Consummate Mask of Rock, where he says, "This is my mask of fidelity to truth and life. This is to cover the mask of pain and desire, the need for human companionship. This is to mask the cover. This is to cover the mask. This is the need of cover. This is the need of the mask." So again, we have this masking, this sense of play, as we do in Joan Jonas's Left Side, Right Side, where Joan takes the screen and splits it and says, "This is my right eye." But because one is mirrored, it's very, very difficult to follow her and for her to follow herself, and everybody gets very confused. So just to finish, I want to just mention the importance of the camera for women in the 70s, because this, the idea of the open system, the open structure, women took up the video camera, as we know, precisely because it had no history. So it was a certain kind of political act, a personal political act, to redefine the way in which women were depicted on the TV screen by the media. And we see an artist like Hannah Wilkie with gestures, her video from 1974. Some of the gestures that she pulls her face into seem comical, but the others are rather tragic. They distort her face into expressions that she absolutely, that people would not find attractive. Likewise, Marina Abramovich's Art Must Be Beautiful, Artist Must Be Beautiful in video, in which she takes two hairbrushes and she's in communist Yugoslavia at the time, a Tito communism, so a very different communism to that of Warsaw, but communism nevertheless, and the social body has such a different reading there. And so still in communist Yugoslavia, in Belgrade, she takes two hairbrushes and pulls them, not only through her hair, but across her face, reciting, "Art must be beautiful, artist must be beautiful," damaging her face, damaging her skin, trying to make a sort of defiant gesture against the dichotomy of the depiction of female beauty in painting versus the impossibility of the female to be, if she's good looking in the remotest way, taken seriously at all as an artist. And at the same time, someone like Ulay, before he met Abramovich, was making very androgynous actions, videotapes and photographs where he was, again, in Germany, trying to sort of undermine that male figure at the end of the war or after the war by going into a very androgynous transvestite state. So all these, I have a few more, but I'm going to end there because I think I've probably gone on too long. All these, I'm just going to actually fast forward to this piece by Anthony McCall, because I think it's also relevant to the idea of open form, which is called Circulation Figures, which is a piece not so known by Anthony, but it was made in London just before he came to New York. And in it, he got a space and placed a mirror at the back and strewed the floor with paper and got together a group of artist friends and filmmakers who brought cameras, film cameras and still cameras, and photographed each other. So they moved around the space, photographing each other. And so again, this very kind of game-like quality, this very sort of playful way in which these gestures were then, there's a film that records everybody making all the different actions with each other. But what underlines all these very playful actions, I think, is something that has a very interesting resonance to the open form experiments that we see in the exhibition next door. And I think it'll be very interesting to tease out some of the issues related to both the similarities and the differences. Thank you.
Hi there. I don't have any images, so maybe it's a good idea to turn on the lights because I see people are getting very sleepy. So I think I was invited here to speak maybe because I spent a little bit of time in Łódź, and Łódź Film Academy, it was actually parallel in the second very, very important center for experimental film and this type of production in Poland in the 70s. I was there for a rather lengthy period of time in 2004, and during which I actually had an incredible opportunity to meet a large group of artists from the workshop group, which was very active in the late 60s, early 70s within the academy. It was a self-organized group of filmmakers. And after this visit, I continued a relationship with Joseph Rabakowski, one of the key figures within this group. And in 2005, I commissioned him to write a text for a publication I was working with Manifesto Foundation on the topic of experimental art education. Joseph did write the text. Unfortunately, the text was on a completely different subject, so we never published it. But the text is very, very interesting, particularly in relationship to this discussion and maybe this exhibition. So I think what I will do is kind of publish it by perhaps reading it to you. There are a couple of disclaimers here. First of all, it contains a lot of Polish names that are just impossible for me to pronounce. So each time when I come to a very long list of names, because Joseph tries to acknowledge and thank a lot of his collaborators of that period, I will not be able to do it. I will try to publish this text in an edited version sometime in the fall in eFlux Journal, so you'll have an opportunity to read it correctly then. And I've never read it in public before, so I really don't know how long it takes. It's about 7 pages, and I will try to read it quickly so as not to go over the time limit. So in that case, I will start right now. It has a very romantic title. It's called The Power of Art. And perhaps it relates to this pragmatist escapism that Łukasz was referring to in his presentation. So, how does one find enough stamina to defend one's convictions? This principal question of the late 1950s and early 1960s was the point of departure for our progressive movement. It had its roots in the University of Torun, and it was a harbinger of freedom in the pseudo-humanitarian Polish People's Republic. I belonged to the family of a disowned landowner, and I had a chance to observe since childhood the communist destruction of my fatherland and my family heirloom. As a war child, I was a staunch anti-communist. My generation made the first conscious cynical gestures against the communist authorities in 1956, when we marched in the streets of Torun in a spontaneous foreign demonstration, shouting anti-government slogans in a huge crowd. I realized, as did many of my colleagues, that it would be possible for a well-organized group to set up some kind of a free, progressive artistic movement, not conforming to the authorities of People's Poland. In the second half of 1950s, Polish culture experienced an enormous growth, still under aegis of socialist slogan of a better world, free from violence. This new, unique artistic consciousness manifested itself in literature, poetry, music, cinema, theater, and plastic arts. It began to radiate outside of Poland, and the new contacts with the artists from abroad burst the earlier provincial and listless socialist culture sponsored by the party. In 1958, I took an entrance exam to the Łódź Film School, which was a special place at the time, an oasis of free artistic thought. I failed, but on that occasion I visited the art museum in Łódź, which displays works of Katarina Kobro and Karol Hiller. That was the modern tradition which had raised Polish art to world-class level. Studying the works of such artists, we were later to formulate our independent analytical program, which found expressions in the activities of the Łódź Workshop of Film Form. In the 1960s, I began studying at the Fine Art Department of the University of Torun. I specialized in museum management and art history. It was a very productive time. I got involved with many interdisciplinary groups such as OKO, 061, Betla, Krug, and thanks to our professors, we managed to distance ourselves from the official cultural policies. Most of these professors had come to Torrent from the Vilnius University, disbanded after World War II. Their absolute independence from the reigning ideology was a model for their students. The metaphorical large-format photographs created by the members of the student amateur art group 061 were dismissed by the official critics as anachronistic, while in fact they impressed the public with their modern form and artistic standard. Today, these poetic photographs from the 60s are regarded by Polish art historians as pioneering postmodern works, since they were motivated by historical awareness in its new expressive symbolic sense. Even then, we already realized that our artistic productions had to be promoted outside the official distribution channels. We showed our photographic works and films at the reviews, and the reviews we organized in the 1960s. We mounted the photographic shows of 061 group in specially adapted venues rather than the official salons managed by the Office of Art Exhibitions. They usually took form of the unannounced momentary interventions into the open public space. All of those experiences of the 061 group and the Creative Students Film Club Petla came handy when I set out, together with my colleagues, to activate them in Łódź, where I had finally came to study in 1966 at the film school, having graduated from the Torrent University. In the next few years, more Torunians came to Łódź, including, and here there is a very, very long list of names. Our ideas were then taken in the late 1960s by other students and graduates of the film school, such as Wojciech Brzezinski, Tadeusz Dziunak, Zbigniew Rybzy, Paweł Kwijek, who was mentioned earlier several times, Richard Waszko, Kazimierz Bednarkowski, Marek Koterski, Richard Gajewski, etc., etc. In 1970, as a student academic circle, we formed a research creative group, the Workshop of Film Form, totally independent from the official didactic program. The first manifesto of this group stated, "The workshop came into being in the 1970s on the initiative of a group of students and graduates of the Łódź School of Film, Television and Theater. Besides filmmakers, it includes artists, musicians, photographers, poets, and technicians. The workshop makes films, recordings, TV broadcasts, radio programs, art exhibitions, various art events and interventions. The workshop also engages in theoretical research and critical study. It explores and expands the potential of audiovisual arts. Note that the workshop does not engage in any commercial activity and its participants work absolutely disinterestedly." Originally, the creative method and techniques of the workshop owed much to Professor Bolesław Liwieski, head of Department of Theory and History of Film. In his eccentric, lively class in the film school in the 1960s, we analyzed various techniques of montage, preparing their graphic scores on paper. It was Professor Liwieski who, since 1966, provided us with classical and current reading material, which became the basis for the development of a broad range of ideas in film and photography. It was thanks to him that we got acquainted with the writings of Alicia Hellman, Claude Levi-Strauss, Roman Jacobson, Edgar Morin, Adam Schaff, Marshall McLuhan, Roland Barthes, Christian Metz, and others, published in Poland in not published in Poland. André Bazin's book, published in Poland in 1963, Film and Reality, was our set reading, and the chapter, The Ontology and Language, from the book we came to know particularly well. Its fragments were cited by Wojciech Brzezinski in the catalogue of Torrent Exhibition in 1969. However, we were more interested in ideas of Bazin's followers, Roland Barthes and Christian Metz. We discovered very early in these books from 1950s and 1960s, researchers regarded photography as a form of reality. In the words of the American avant-garde filmmaker from the 1940s, Maya Deren, in photography, the object creates its own image by radiating its light onto a photosensitive film. No human participates in this process. This is the source of the realism of a photographic image. This materialistic view, adopted by André Bazin, was relativized in the 1960s by Barthes and Metz. Their new attitude towards photographic reality was taken up by by the late 1960s by the future members of the workshop. Pavel Kujek even carried out some research on this issue with the participants of the Action Workshop at the Art Museum of Łódź in 1973. The relationship between the subjective and the objective was the principal issue we set out to investigate in the beginning of the 1970s, both in our writings and in our works. We found a kindred soul in completely unpronounceable name, I'm sorry, from Warsaw, well-versed in theory. In 1971, we entered into close cooperation with him, inviting him to participate in many art events that we instigated at that time. At the time, one second. Individual initiatives led us to develop since 1970s new personal contacts with outstanding artists. Our partners abroad included Malcolm Legrais, Richard DeMarco, William and Birgit Hein, Jörg Klausberg, Takahiko Limura, Peter Weibel, Valley Expert, El Becke, William Raban, Paul Shartis, David Curtis, P. Rubin, Dora Morer, Gabor Bodi, Marina Abramovic, Valos Floris Nusus, and many others, whom it is impossible to mention here. We also learned more about art and culture thanks to the books from the Italian Centro D, which we obtained in exchange for our theoretical publications. The whole complicated arrangement of international contacts was made possible thanks to the Post-Art project, which we developed in the early 1970s. All the above shows that our general orientation was composed of many threads. Wow, I'm really reading this very badly, I'm sorry. The workshop was an open project, its main aim being interpersonal communication and exchange of ideas. Our private contacts enabled us to peep beyond the communist curtain, and post-art gave us a chance of explicating the ideas contained in our works, documents, photographs, text, films, and video films. It is worth mentioning here that the analytical rational practices had appeared in our works already in 1960s. They had particularly many followers within the Multimedia Arts Association, called Krug Circle. My first films, which I presented at my exam to the film school in 1958-59, called Feet, Sea, Mini Painterly Luxograms, Carmen, Labyrinth, Forest, my trick photographs, Drunkard of 1959, and above all, my first photographic object, Strainer of 1960, are neo-Dada works. Our films from 1962 and my personal constructed collages used found footage, which was quite unique in 1962. Our other important works from that time included early synthetic photographs of Wiesław Wojulanis, which were akin to American photography, e.g. work of Edwards Weston, the motif of a half cabbage. Another important project of analytical rational character involved the so-called references, which first appeared in my work entitled Blacksmith of 1962, presenting a portrait of a blacksmith from the small town inserted into a big photograph of a toil-worn hand. This work is now in the collection of the Regional Museum in Torun. More of the references turned up later in a large university exhibition of the 061 group, mounted in the yard of Collegium Minus in Krakow. It was then that we juxtaposed our work with the elements of the environment in open space. This precursory rational gesture was noted by two Warsaw reviewers of the exhibition. I described this project in my report of development in the book, The Decade 1980s-1990s. I also discuss it in several essays published by Centrum Sztuki. The references turn up once again in 1966 in another form of multimedia exhibition event of the Krug Association, where we juxtaposed various natural curiosities, a two-headed calf, stuffed birds, human and animal skeletons, an enormous vertebra of a whale, which we had borrowed from the Department of Earth Scientists, with our works displayed in a poorly lit gallery. Other neo-Dada works were presented at the second exhibition of Krug at the Regional Museum in Torun in 1977. The artist most in evidence there was the fictional character Joseph Corbiella, who showed the objects entitled Lady with a Necklace and Epitaph for Jan Gnat, and pastiches of perfectly executed academic works in a style topical of our professors. The photographs by Jerzy Wajzak and Andrzej, sorry, can't pronounce the last name, consisting of rhythmical arrangements of pre-war postcards set to the old song, "What Would This World Be Without Love?" gravitated towards the surreal. Other authors of collages and film would later include Antoni Mikołajczuk and M. Kokot. Such critical, ironic, or sarcastic attitude is characteristic of many works created by the member of 061 group since its inception. In 1967, even before the subjective exhibition in Krakow, I became particularly interested in the problem of duality, in the juxtaposition of the real world with an illusory one, in mirror reflections, various interactive objects, films and trick photographs I was making at the film school. This interest culminated in a large-size photograph object, Bicycle Wheel, from 1969, a tautological work. I juxtaposed a real white bicycle wheel with a luxographic image of that object. My stance was also manifested in other photographs, such as 10 Fields of Acuity, 4 Fields of Acuity, both from 1969. The first film of the workshop, entitled The Market, made by my colleagues Tadeusz Junak and R. Meissner in 1970 in the Red Market in Łódź, and Other Spatial Object Ear by Wojciech Brużewski from 1971, shown at the exhibition of the Searching Photographers at the Warsaw Contemporary Gallery, which also were of analytical character. Similar attempts were made by Antoni Mikołajczuk and Paweł Kujek. In the late 1960s, even before the establishment of the workshop, we had discovered in a class of film animation conducted by Professor Kotowski the precursors of analytical photographic sequences. We were most fascinated by Edward Maybridge, T. Atkinson, Etienne Jules Marais, and the Italian futurists. The style and content of their works were explored most by Zbigniew Rubishski, whose graphic style and complex film realizations were later universally admired. Another personality in the workshop was its youngest member, Paweł Kujek, who began cooperating as a camera operator with the students of Warsaw Academy of Fine Arts. This team elaborated the spatial concept of Professor Oskar Hansen. It included, and then there is a very long list of names, including Sofia Kulek. The films they made together, analyzing the interesting idea of the open forum, were presented at Łódź Film School during the meeting of the 8th Cinema in 1971, and a year later at Zakopane at the Review of Films on Art. In the early 1970s brought an unprecedented eruption in creative activity of the students and graduates of art academies, manifested in Nova Ruda, where in 1971 we met Jan, with a very complicated name, inviting him immediately to Łódź. We began traveling with our films and sets of photographs to many Polish galleries. We visited several cities, Krakow, Warsaw, Gdańsk, Lublin, Poznań, Toruń, and finally organized a large self-sponsored international review of expanded cinema entitled Kino Laboratorium in 1973 at Galeria L. Our project, Osmy Kino, the 8th Cinema, was intended to counterbalance the 3rd Cinema, a group of young filmmakers pampered by the critics, laureates of the official state festivals, such as Krzysztof Kieslowski. We had supported among the editors of Krakow Weekly Magazine students, we had supporters among the critics, yes, where we managed to publish 2 interventionist texts, our statement written collectively and my lampoon on cinematography. So we can actually go a little bit further. Okay. We were decidedly against operations on reality in the romantic style of Tadeusz Kantor. Our works entered the natural urban environment, meaning during the event entitled Furniture Sale in 1971 in the Red Market in Łódź. On an autumn morning, we asked an amateur artist to sell out the various pieces of furniture I had inherited from my aunt at absurdly low prices. A large stand with wardrobes, mirrors, sofas, and old books was surrounded by bystanders and buyers. At noon, the seller vanished. After a few minutes, it turned out that everything that had belonged to my aunt was gone. The only object left was an old sofa set on fire by some hooligans. We observed people's reactions and talked to them. We were interested in our interlocutors. The event let us revise our mental schemas and preconceptions. At another occasion, we also left the field to other people, instigating a collective declamation, word by randomly approached passerbys of the poem Ode to Youth by Polish national poet Adam Mickiewicz in Piotrkowska Street, the main street of Łódź. During the action workshop at the Łódź Art Museum, we conducted perhaps the first art TV broadcast in the world from several sites in the city. We transmitted 3 TV images with sound effects with the aid of school's mobile broadcasting unit for 12 hours, from a private flat at a carpenter shop and a busy intersection to a room at the museum. We also called a competition for an artistic signature, which enjoyed enormous interest. The works sent into the competition were shown at the art museum, and we gave valuable book awards to the winners. At another time, Pavel Kujik encouraged schoolchildren in several provincial towns near Łódź to create film etudes. The whole group performed in various cities with Edward Kowalski Theater of Pensioners. We became his devout followers, performing his play entitled The Career and Death of Adolf Hitler at a school theater and at the art museum during the action workshop, even mentioned here. In 1974, we made a film entitled Reincarnation as an homage to our professor, Unstuck. Thanks to our cooperation with many artists lacking formal education and technical expertise, we managed many times to enter new creative territories, which was the source of great artistic satisfaction. Seeking to educate ourselves, we organized semiological symposiums and conferences at the film school. We published our theoretical writings and analyzed many archival fields of the first avant-garde in France, Germany, and Russia. We studied montage devices and tricks in films made by members of the Soviet school, Dziga Vertov, Sergei Eisenstein, Pudovkin. We traveled to Warsaw to see the performances at Jerzy Grotowski's theater. We discovered in the archive the only preserved pre-war film made by Francisca and Stafford Temerson, The Adventures of an Honest Man from 1937, which was presented at the International Review Kino Laboratorium. So maybe we're almost, there is a few more name lists. Well, it's quite interesting. We presented our etude for discussion at the film schools in Moscow and German Democratic Republic, maintained systematic contacts with Hungarian filmmakers, and as a result made a new interesting contacts with other young filmmakers of the so-called communist bloc. Finally, the workshop of film form was discovered by the owner of an Edinburgh gallery, Richard DeMarco, during his stay in Łódź. He invited us to the Edinburgh Film Festival as members of the large Polish project called Atelier 72. There, for the first time, I had a chance to present our works along the works of outstanding Polish and foreign avant-garde. At the invitation of curators and artists who visited many Western European cities such as Antwerp, Amsterdam, Kassel, London, Paris, Cologne, Düsseldorf, Venice, etc. But we also showed our works in Moscow, Prague, Budapest, Belgrade. The enormous artistic output of our multimedia group was presented for the first time at the Monographic Exhibition of the Workshop of Film Form at the Center for Contemporary Art in Warsaw in the year 2000. The exhibition, several huge rooms at the CCA were filled with the works of different character, mostly film projections, photographs, spatial installations, interactive objects, TV documents and broadcasts, and visual text. An accompanying exhibition displayed booklets, unique publications, posters, photographic documentation. Today, the workshop has its own monographs written by Richard Klusacki, Łukasz Ronduda, and Joseph Rabakowski. Films made by the groups are distributed in Poland and abroad, evoking ever bigger interest. After 40 years of this fervent activity, I often ask myself, how is it all possible in a provincial Poland enslaved by communist ideology enforced on us by the Soviet regime? But I am convinced today that we owe it to the power of art, and art appears in capital letters, which we always regard as a heaven of freedom. It was for us an article of faith that an artist can influence the shape of reality, armed with the belief that someone still needs him. That's it.
So, I think Anton has proven that 7 minutes of text does not equal 5 minutes. But can you guys come up here, please? So we're going to just quickly turn to some questions since we're running behind and we'd like to get to the gallery soon to see the opening. So I just thought I'd open it up to the audience to see if anybody has any specific questions for any of the speakers or any anticipatory questions about the exhibition, which we're about to see.
Can you address the issue of opera aperta of Umberto Eco that was published at almost the same time?
Does he mean the book? You mean the book from 2005?
Sorry, I mean that Umberto Eco established.
Oh, Umberto Eco.
Sorry, Umberto Eco published at the same time a piece called Opera Aperta, which is generally known in the West, so to speak, as the open book. So it's exactly the same words and actually same concept. So I wonder if you can say something about that.
Did they know Eco?
Yes, they know, but it's completely different, I think. But as Felicity presented open form by Hansen, we see that it was really...
Is that on?
Yes, Umberto Eco was translated into Polish quite early, but this concept of open form was, as Chrissie also described, American situation was in the air, let's say, in the 60s, and in art and in literature. So it was not a direct relation between Eco book and these activities we are showing at the exhibition.
So apparently, no relationship. Anything else? I'm just going to pose a couple of very quick questions in because we do want to run out of the gallery. The first I'm going to pose to Felicity, and it's around this question of the processual and participatory practice of open form, because we know all the participants declared their obsession with cybernetics, they declared their obsessions with communications theory, and they, to the point that they enacted themselves as almost like cybernetic agents, as you showed in the film. And I'm wondering about that relationship in which open form becomes a type of process, a literalization of communication theory, let's say, and something like Hansen's electronic projects. In the exhibition, we showed the electronic music studio, and you showed the Skopje project, in which there's an idea about the building itself transforming through an electronic effect. And I don't know, this might be a lot to ask, but I'm just wondering if you've thought about what the relationship is between something like cybernetics as a paradigm for collective interaction versus something like a building as a cybernetic mechanism, and how that might work for Hansen's open form.
No, I haven't thought about the precise articulation that you suggest, but certainly I was trying to raise the question, even if somewhat laterally, of if we think about the degree to which some of these ideals of electronic spaces, later came to be understood as really haunted by technologies of control. Yeah, that they reveal themselves not only to require another set of sort of functional determinants. I was trying, I guess, at some point to put a little bit of pressure on how that might also be thought of in regard to their quite utopian thinking about electronics. But the work, I mean, one project that I hope people will go and pay some attention to, which I think is a fantastic film, is the project in the studios at 123, yeah, where the artist is asking each of the camera operators to shoot him in a particular way, and he's saying, you know, so now we turn to camera 1, and now we turn to camera 2, and this is a film that was shown on television. I should come back to Chrissie's suggestion, and it's a film that in effect shows the sort of reveals the constructed nature of the image, yeah, for the television audience. And I think that also a number of the other films had a similar. I mean, I know this doesn't speak exactly to what you're asking, but there was a sense of a sort of incredible self-consciousness and attention to exactly how this media image was being constructed and disseminated. Yes, that I think is maybe lacking in something like the Skopje project. And so to that degree, I think that you know, not only does this sort of dialogue go both ways, but the sort of lessons, the sort of attentiveness that the architects might take back from the artists and the way they deployed the concept of open form and sort of translated it into a different set of tactics, and may indeed sort of need to fold back further into the architectural context. I know that doesn't answer your question exactly, but it's sort of how I was trying to stage those.
No, that's very helpful. I'm going to ask Łukasz one last question before we head over. To me, it's a slightly related question, which is that if the music studio versus the open form as a kind of interactivity is at question, your phrase that the artists were trying to accelerate the revolution seems, you know, an incredibly compelling way to describe the activity. But of course, that begs the question of what kind of revolution they were trying to accelerate. And when you think about the type of revolutionary practices that Chrissie was describing, which are revolutionary in terms of their application of new media technologies, revolutionary, you know, if we're going to use that term loosely, in relationship to status of objects, etc., you clearly mean something else. You mean much more explicit political program. Nonetheless, what I'm interested in is what becomes of objects within that notion of the accelerated revolution you're describing, because so much of the emphasis was placed on these collective interactive procedures. Was there a specific attitude about objects for the artists that were showing?
As mediating devices.
Yes,
okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
Just actually to lead the objects and to invent communication as a kind of field of as an object, and it was what exactly was the question, how they perceive this.
Another way, I mean, it's a different question, but maybe related in some degree. I mean, it's very, one thing I didn't say, but Hansen, who, like these artists, was very, very committed to the possibility of a socialist revolution, yeah, and actually, you know, desperately wanted to participate in the construction of an environment that would be appropriate to this. And he was likewise prohibited from playing that out, yes, and this is in effect the moment that he ceased to operate as an architect and began to teach in an art school, and I don't know if that you know, was to suggest that he would be less controversial there, but I think it's very interesting that Kulik also believed in the possibility of an idea of socialism that was in fact not the dominant, I mean obviously not the dominant form, and that which, you know, was unable to play out. Maybe
yes, it was okay. Now can continue. So they were the only students of Hansen who were thinking in such a large scale. The other students of Hansen were really thinking in like private gallery space. They had this project of modernization, like Hansen from architecture. They also took this kind of approach to reality, that thinking in the scale of the country, of the socialist system. So it was really important that they wanted to also take this scale from architecture and apply it to fine arts, and this revolution, this new modes of communication were also kind of placed in such a scale. They were meant to operate in the scale of the society. That's why we are in our exhibition with Mark. We are showing a lot of TV programs. They are kind of visions of television, of cinematography. So this dominant media, which they try to influence, they try to promote this concept of open form, in their artistic practice, like games, interactions. In a larger social sphere, they wanted to use this mass media to promote this art, which they thought as a truly socialist art for them, kind of art which makes improves social communication, which kind of focuses on kind of grassroots communication, which helps people to self-organize, to kind of be more creative, is in essence socialist. So, and they thought that this open form is socialist by itself, but by its essence. They were not essentialists, but they thought so about open form, and they proposed it to the state. They thought that socialist state should take it as official art, because it was for them also obvious that it should be promoted by the state. It should be it should replace this art which state preferred, which was like conventional kind of figurative art. And I'd like to also stress that they referred to this Russian avant-garde of the 20s. So, and probably it was the last moment and the last avant-garde which tried to really connect these revolutionary artistic ideas with state. Sometimes we analyzing Russian Revolution, and many artists in the West also refer to this art, radical political art. We kind of forget that these Bolsheviks, like these Russian communist artists, they thought about their art like closely in connection with a state, with the state official politics. So, and here we have the same situation. This scheme is repeated, and also the consequence, like the end of the story is also similar. So they were kind of rejected by the state and severely punished.
Łukasz, it's not exactly the same situation in the sense that I often felt, let's say, in many Eastern European countries that, or like for example in Berlin, we were based, my building was based on formerly a place that was called Leninplatz, and right next to it there is Karl Marx Platz. After 1989, Leninplatz was renamed United Nations Plaza, Karl Marx Platz stayed the same, and it's very clear why. Lenin was always perceived as an imposed figure. Communism was always something that was imposed from the outside, right, that kind of disappears later. So, you know, like a lot of the Russian avant-garde and, you know, after the revolution, they really embraced it as their own. It was not an imposition. In Poland, there was always this moment of occupation, you know?
No, not in the case of these artists.
That's very interesting.
This is interesting that they were from these communist families, and they really believed in the system. It was not the case of Robakowski, for example. And the rest of the Polish avant-garde, yes, they perceived the system as imposed. But this artist, not. For them, it was their system.
And then it's very interesting that it results in a production that's on many levels very, very similar, you know? This kind of completely anti-communist tendency and this desire for the better socialism, to improve socialism, actually develops into a very similar practice. I mean, there is a kind of interesting paradox in there, no?
Yes, of course, but yes.
It's also interesting that in London in the late 60s, Marxism was being embraced. You know, Machunas was embracing the Russian revolutionary ideas of the early, 18 to early 20s, but in London it was Marxism, and that's kind of paradoxical given. And of course, people like R.D. Laing, who were very important with that alternative psychiatry and all of that. That was a very important issue in London as well. But I think it's sort of kind of paradoxical that in New York you have someone like Machunas doing something very similar to what was going on in Poland, being in Eastern Europe, coming from Eastern Europe. Yet in London, there was this sort of very idealistic embracing that I remember throughout the 70s, late 70s. Of Marxism and Trotskyism.
There is another, maybe if we have another second, sometimes Boris Groys speaks about the opposition within the opposition. For example, when he talks about Moscow conceptualism, he describes them as, there was kind of a very large underground art scene, which was mainly dedicated to production of very uninteresting objects, kind of modernistic-looking paintings, still lifes, things like that, right? And they were kind of rejecting the official socialist realism style. And within that group of underground artists, there was a group of kind of rejectionists within the rejection that actually embraced socialist ways of representation, the visual language, etc., like Kabakov. And in the end, this kind of internal group made quite interesting cultural production. In a way, you're talking about this group of artists in Warsaw, so it seems it's almost some kind of an opposition within opposition.
But it's different.
Of course.
They were embracing in Russia, in Soviet Russia, the Kabakov and the others. They were kind of ironically playing with this state official propaganda, and these artists they proposed replacement of this state promoted propaganda with avant-garde art. It was like an offer.
Fabulous. So let's take up the offer then of the avant-garde replacement for the state, and take up the offer of a drink over in the gallery. Thank you very much. Yeah. I wish we had time. It's obviously these things always go.
Oh, yeah.